Good afternoon and a very warm welcome once again. We come back and uh, start this next part of our discussion today on building the strategic enablers and the policy ecosystem for the road to Atmanirbhar Bharat. It gives me great pleasure and to welcome Anantha Nageswaran here to this part of our discussion today. As all of you know him, he's a eminent economist, a part-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and someone who has um, uh, an interesting take on the Indian economy. Mr. Nageswaran, welcome to this webinar on behalf of Swarajya and on behalf of NEWJ, which is India's one of the largest social media publisher. I'm going to start and do this in a question and answer format, and I'll also encourage the audience to chip in with questions. We have roughly 25 minutes on this part of the debate, and I'm going to begin straight away on the first question that is being generated primarily by recent comments by former chief economic advisors, their criticism of Atmanirbharta and the insinuation that it represents a turn away from the global economic order as far as India is concerned. Is that criticism justified? And does it fall short in taking into account the needs of the Indian economy from a growth as well as job creation perspective? That was the first question to you.
So thank you for having me in this program. And I managed to catch the last few minutes of the remarks made by Mr. Amitabh Kant. It's very hard to follow in his footsteps, both in terms of spirit and in terms of substance. But let me try my best here. So yeah, I have seen the articles and paper written by Dr. Arvind Subramaniam. I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, not as a member of the Economic Advisory Council. So there is a context to most economic policy measures. I mean, he does mention, and correctly so, that India's growth turnaround, where the decadal averages did climb from 3.5% up to 1970s and 5% in the 1980s to something like 6%. In the 90s and 7% in the first decade of the millennium, etc. So there's a steady uptick in the average growth rate every decade, and that it happened because of export performance, which picked up along with economic openness. And economic openness, among other things, did involve a reduction in import duties, which made exports also, everything else being equal, relatively more competitive. So I think all of that is indeed correct. But every policy decision has a context. And the fact remains that well before India began to contemplate some higher duties on certain categories of imported products in the last 2-3 years, the fact remains that developed world had already started questioning the benefits of globalization, both in the aggregate sense and in the distributional sense within their societies. And therefore, they had started to sort of roll back or unwind some of the enthusiasm for globalization. And moreover, with the passing years, it became quite evident that one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization, which was China, wasn't really giving back as much to the rest of the world as it was benefiting from it. Its commitment to some of the, its willingness to translate some of its commitments made when it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 into reality turned out to be rather, ephemeral. I mean, as Dr. Jaishankar puts it, China has indeed used inexactitude in some of the agreements to sort of delay fulfilling its part. And I remember reading William Galston Jr., who was a bureaucrat in the Clinton administration in the last decade of the previous millennium, that some of the commitments China had made on the General Procurement Agreement, 17 years later, in 2017 and 18, had still not been complied with. So this is the context. So any policy shouldn't be driven by ideology, but by the benefits it confers on the society. There will be cost. As long as we are clear about the net benefits, then we should be continuing to persist with them. When the benefits become questionable or they begin to diminish and costs begin to mount, we shouldn't be hesitant to take corrective action, which is what the government of India has done. So I don't think it should be viewed in the ideological framework. I mean, free trade cannot be ideological. Free trade has to be pragmatic, because free trade and fair trade both go together.
Right. The couple of points that arise from your remarks. The first would be that if you were to, in relatively easier terms for the entire audience to understand, comment quickly about the nature of growth or the areas from which growth will accrue to India over the next 2 decades, because a lot of people are saying that the previous phase, the post-reforms, 90 reforms phase is over. The amount of bad debt that is in the system could be part of that. Where will the next 2 decades of growth come from as far as India is concerned?
No, relatively speaking, definitely the growth will come from domestic sources. Not that exports will ever become completely unimportant or irrelevant, because exports do provide an important source of benchmarking for quality, which will benefit domestic consumers as well. So I don't think exports will completely become irrelevant or insignificant, but there will be a marginal shift, an important shift nonetheless, of emphasis, which will be that India's growth will be driven by domestic investment, infrastructure, and consumption. And exports will definitely be there, but not to the extent we enjoy a benefit from export-led growth between 2003 and 2008, when exports contributed roughly 1.5 to 2 percentage points of growth every year. That is unlikely, not because India is turning inward, but simply because the average growth rates in our markets, whether it is Europe or North America, that is going to go down. That indeed had gone down already in the decade between 2010 and 2020. To some extent, they were able to maintain some growth rates because of the massively easy monetary policies that they adopted. But now, with response to in response to COVID, they had overextended themselves in terms of fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. So their growth rates in the coming decade is going to be even lower than what it was in between 2010 and 20. So therefore, their willingness to accept imports from other countries will go down. Whether or not we do it, they will become more protectionist. Whether it is apparent or overt or covert, it will happen. Therefore, by the sheer change in circumstances and compulsions of the reality, India's growth in the coming decade will be more domestic demand driven, with some contributions opportunistically coming from exports.
The several quick points that emerge from your comments, and I'm going to try and get them out quickly so that we can move on to other topics. The first point, we joined the WTO ahead of China. That is the point that you made. Today, China has very clear intentions of dominating the entire global economic chain, and we see that in multiple sectors. Our previous phase of growth, Mr. Nageswaran, came from the fact that we benefited from free trade. China wants to do the reverse, and we are head to head against China now due to several things that have happened in the recent past. How do we manage that?
So, I mean, obviously, managing the challenges that have emerged with respect to China is not only economic but also geostrategic. And India has been taking steps, whether it is the initiative with the Quad countries. We hope that some of it continues under the new administration in the United States that might be in office from January 20th. And also our own policy decisions with respect to investment restrictions on certain categories of countries, or in terms of technology openness to some of their consumer products and applications, etc. We are doing that, and we took a very conscious decision not to be part of the One Belt One Road initiative, which has turned out to be a good decision, because several countries that enthusiastically participated are now finding themselves saddled with debt. So these are the ways in which we are responding. However, in order to benefit from the supply chain that are now trying to relocate from China, partly because of security concerns and partly because of the unfairness or the unilateralism with which some of these agreements have resulted in benefits to only one side, Western manufacturers and producers would be looking for alternatives, and we need to benefit from that. So our response has been not so much as inward, but in fact, recently I read the Fitch Ratings has said some of India's recent reforms since May 2020 have actually boosted the medium-term growth prospects in the country. And definitely some of it would spill over into export. So I think the India's policy framework in the last year, despite COVID, has been to take those steps which would boost the medium-term growth prospects, because the last decade, between 2010 and 2020, India's growth has suffered because India grew on an unsustainable basis in the previous decade, based on credit, investment, and export-led growth. And the credit and investment boom had led to indigestion. And that is what we were trying to get rid of, and we are still getting rid of them when COVID happened. So hopefully, in the coming decade, we will see the kind of capital inflows that we saw in the first decade of the millennium, which will in turn lead to a massive pickup in infrastructure investment and domestic consumption and production, and they will be the predominant drivers of growth. So our strategy is boosting the medium-term growth prospects by equipping the economy, both in terms of hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, to be able to grow. Definitely, export will be a part of it, but not the big part of it as it was between 03 and 08. Even then, it was not the biggest part. The biggest part was domestic investment boom and domestic consumption.
Our first wave of growth, the first 30 years really, post 1990, came with a full-fledged embrace of WTO, free trade, regional trade agreements, and that has also led to a significant and premature amount of deindustrialization.
Yeah.
Now we seem to be correcting some of those wrongs.
That's right.
Are you confident that Atmanirbhar Bharat, in its current form, the current package of Atmanirbhar Bharat, because it can continuously evolve, is good enough to reverse deindustrialization to a significant extent?
So predominantly the answer is yes, it is good enough. Naturally, we cannot say anything with certitude in economic policy, because we have to be open to evidence and course correction. And that is what we have seen with this government in the last 6 years, with either with respect to the feedback that came when demonetization happened, or the feedback that came when IBC was introduced, the bankruptcy code, and the feedback that came from the field for the goods and services tax, and course corrections have been made to the extent that some people say, this is afterthought. Not necessary. I mean, there is only that much of planning that can be done. So what has been done, I was quite impressed with Dr. Amitabh Kant's comments, that it is not so much about inwardness as it was about creating global champions. And he also made it very clear, it is not about protection, it is about promotion combined with performance. So if it is purely about extending a certain protection only to encourage sloth and complacency, we should be concerned. But I think it is incentives with respect to a certain benchmarks being met year after year after year, and there is a terminal date for these incentives being offered. And I mean, you did refer in your remarks, Siddharth, to the Credit Suisse report as well that came out today. So I think, on balance, my answer to your question is the current framework of Atmanirbhar Bharat is on the right track. It is learned from the mistakes of the first 40 years of our India since independence, and hopefully it will deliver goods on the ground. And if it doesn't, we should be open to correcting the elements of it based on evidence.
I want to come back from the medium long term to the here and now. And I'll try and do this in rapid fire format, if you permit me, in the remaining time that we have. So interesting economic situation that we are faced with, and many of us have obviously never seen, or actually none of us have actually ever seen such economic circumstances. It's an absolute black swan. So Indian economy, low oil prices, low global interest rates, and both have their consequences. And I believe that this is what matters the most to India. In the current year itself, we will see perhaps closer to $15 billion of savings on the oil account.
Yeah.
Given that this year will also likely see a current account surplus, what does it mean in terms of government spending priorities? Because we are seeing the government actually cut back as far as capex is concerned.
No, capex cutback usually happens much more in the state government than in the union government. And in fact, if you look at the monthly accounts of the current financial year from the CGA website, I think at the end of September and even up to October, Indian government has maintained its spending pattern in line with the previous year. In fact, we are doing better than the previous year in terms of the proportional spending for the year at the end of 6 months and 7 months of the financial year. Obviously, in the face of revenues that have fallen massively, government's borrowings has indeed increased tremendously, talking about the union government. So really, the bulk of the concern should lie with the ability of the state governments to take advantage of their borrowing capacities and to put those monies to use in capex. And I think Dr. Kant mentioned about the power sector. Again, the bulk of the decisions and the things have to happen at the state government's level.
Explain to all those who are participating, and I know that they will want this question to be asked. Explain to them that when global oil, crude oil went into negative territory or was at its lowest ever, why have petroleum prices and diesel prices? In fact, in the last 24 hours, petrol and diesel are the most expensive ever in India. Explain to them why this happens.
So naturally, I mean, this is exactly similar to what happened with the government of India's decisions in 2014-15 and 2015-16, when they took advantage of the lower input price to maintain the consumer price at a slightly higher level, to be able both to fulfill our climate change obligations, as well as to sort of make sure that the government revenues are maintained at a particular level, given the steep fall off we have experienced with respect to direct tax revenues and so on. So clearly it's a mixture of a revenue augmentation as well as a sort of a carbon emission control measure, both operating in tandem.
All right. One more point. A lot of people say that there's been too much reform also.
Too much what?
And a lot of people say that there has been too much reform, too much change over the last few years. You know what I am alluding to. Is that a factor? Should we now allow domestic industry some time, breathing space to stabilize, to reinvest, to undertake fresh investments? Because so much has changed on every side.
No, I think there is no holy grail, or there is no golden mean here. One can always be either accused of doing too much or too little. I think along with these reforms, the government also has decriminalized many of the company law provisions that were introduced in 2013 after the Satyam scandal, and the government has lowered the corporate taxes, and now the ease of doing business has to move towards state and local government. So along with the fundamental changes like insolvency and bankruptcy, which actually benefits businesses, businesses to sort of recover the debt capital and the GST, which is actually open up the national market for many scale producers. So most of these reforms are actually conferring more benefits than requiring behavioral changes on the part of businesses. So I wouldn't call them as too much of a burden being imposed on our businesses. So it is indeed onus is on them to step up to the plate, which I think they will, because the last decade was all about deleveraging after the first decade where they completely took on more debt. So I have a feeling that this decade, India is more likely to repeat the experience of 03 to 08 when there was an investment and growth recovery on a very strong basis.
A couple of more points. What is your own sense about the recovery as far as GDP is concerned? Because GDP is just a number to most people. What it really counts for is jobs and a sense of well-being. When do you think we will have a robust recovery?
So, I mean, if you look at the IMF forecast for India up to 2026 financial year, 25-26, March 2020, they do project the Indian GDP to grow in dollar terms up to $4 trillion, basically projecting about 8.9, about 9% dollar GDP growth in nominal terms, of course. And in Indian rupee terms, it is 12%. And if you accept that the inflation would be somewhere between 4 and 5%, they are projecting a 7 to 8% nominal GDP, a real GDP growth for India, which I think is attainable because we will be catching up with the last two, with this year and next year's relative slowdown. Beyond that, I feel that if we can average for the rest of the decade from 2022 onwards, somewhere between 6 and 7% real growth, we will have done very well because export growth will still be at least 1 percentage point lower than what it was between 03 and 08. Therefore, I'm looking at between 6 and 7% average real GDP growth for the remainder of the decade from 2022 onwards.
A question by Bhartendu Sinha. Why has literacy remained so low? He says 78% in 20. Literacy
Yeah.
Remains so low, 78% in 2020 instead of getting this to above 95% on a war footing. Most countries that have grown out of poverty have prioritized literacy, as then people can get themselves out of poverty.
Well, I think I do feel it's obviously I completely agree with the question and the thrust and the priority behind it. I think the new education policy exactly aims to address that. But also we must note that our trajectory has been on the right direction, and even the state of the education reports, although the progress could be much faster, is noting some improvement in our comprehension, readability of our children, etc. But I completely agree that if at all there is a major plank of growth that needs to happen for the medium term, it has to be education, literacy, and also I would add the skill factor.
Why is money so expensive in India, considering that the world is awash with liquidity and you have negative interest rates? We don't want negative interest rates in India, but why is money, growth capital, still so expensive in India, perhaps the most expensive in the world?
This is a question that probably needs a day-long seminar to answer in full. But honestly, the answer is that some of the interest rates are still administered in nature, and we need to free up most of the interest rates into market-determined rates. That's number one. Number two, our combined fiscal deficit and debt is still on the high side, and naturally, our credit rating at the moment is just a notch above the sub-investment grade. And fourth, lastly, and this is an important point, investors and financial markets do treat developing countries and developed countries differently. These are my short answers for what is a fairly substantive question.
I have one question on environment and forest clearances, which will be the last on today's session, but I want a quick follow-up on this one. So how really and by when do you think we can become Atmanirbhar as far as money is concerned? And you understand the question that I'm asking. We talk about Atmanirbharta in manufacturing, in technology, but when it comes to global finance, when it comes to capital, we still are a poor nation. how do we become Atmanirbhar when it comes to money?
So I think that will come with growth. So it's a sort of it's a mutual dependent cycle here. And many developing countries in our growth phase, when our domestic savings is relatively low, we will continue to depend on global capital. And the good news is that the coming decade, global capital is going to be looking for opportunities in places like ours. And that's evident already in the current year's numbers, despite COVID. So I think it will be at least a decade, if not longer, away before we become Atmanirbhar when it comes to our capital needs. And hopefully, with every passing year, it is because growth will build up our own savings. It will become mutually reinforcing, and that date can be sort of fast forwarded from 2 decades to 1 decade or so. But at least a decade more, I see that happening. It will take at least a decade longer.
Uh, I recently spoke with someone who is participating in the PLI scheme, and the feedback that I got was that they are worried about some delays, supply side issues, China-related delays, availability of equipment.
Okay.
There is another feedback that one still gets, which is environment and forest clearances. There has been so much reform, but the sense one gets is that environment and forest clearances have still not been reformed. It is more a judicial approval rather than an approval based on economic necessity and economic rationale. Can we come out of this, or will the judiciary or quasi-judicial intent keep a stranglehold on forest and environment clearances?
No, I think it's a good question for which there is no easy answer available. I would even say perhaps in the larger scheme of things, to the extent that there are delays because of this, I would accept it as part and parcel of the price to be paid for growth, which has to unfortunately or fortunately balance out these considerations. And some of these constraints may not have been there for countries like China or today's developed countries when they were growing, but the reality is that we are faced with climate change and global warming and extreme weather events, etc. Therefore, to the extent that there is a judicial or an NGO sector scrutiny of environmental impact, we must accept it as a price to be paid along with growth. So it is something that we have to manage, which we cannot fully get rid of. That is the view I take in a personal sense. Yeah.
A follow-up to this, would I be correct in saying and raising this point that we are a poor country still, but we have adopted and adapted first world rules. We can barely walk, but our compliance is at a global level. And this is the real difficulty, that we want to be like the West. We want to have so many things, but the reality in India is so difficult. If you cannot allow a company to set up a mining plant quickly, if you make them wait for 3 years, or if you cannot provide a clearance to build a road or a flyover, how will you develop? You will still remain poor while you try to comply with global rules and regulations.
Absolutely. I think that, you have raised a very important point, and I wish there is a sort of an in principle answer to it that can address it, which unfortunately there isn't. It has to be a sort of a case by case approach where you balance the need for development and balance the need for environmental concern, which is not exactly anti-development either, because the bulk of the price is being paid. For example, India's biggest problem is not so much the same issues that the West is facing. Ours is more of water pollution and sanitation. So we need to be, you're absolutely right, we need to focus on, even within environmental climate change areas, we need to focus on those problems that are relevant to us and not necessarily the West's problems. Because per capita carbon emission for India is a much lower side than it is for other countries in the West. So in principle, I am with you that we need to find a way of managing those environmental concerns that are relevant to us, whether in terms of building in coastal zones or high flooding areas, and also managing the stubble burning.
Can I please allow me to interrupt you? I'm sorry for the interruption. Almost 10, 12 years ago, the G20 said that India, among other countries, and there were debates, the global climate conference, India was supposed to get a massive amount of money for climate mitigation. That money has never come, Mr. Nageswaran. But the changes arising out of that with regard to environment and compliance for Indian industry have kept going up. We have on our own voluntarily decided to, move away from certain things, plastic pollution things. So there is no money for industry on one hand, yet we are forcing more and more and more compliance on industry. Look at what is going to happen very soon with the changes to the wage bill. The Provident Fund contribution of employers and employees will go up to 50%, which is more or less closer to Scandinavian standards, forget Asian standards. So how do you explain this discrepancy to me? Well, allow me this one point. I sometimes say this, and I'm saying this as my final interjection, and we'll wrap up then, that a lot of our policymakers and the debate, the intellectual debate, is generated by Indians who have studied overseas, who are top-ranking performers in their respective fields, and then they come and bring this architecture and want to impose it on a country where clean water is still a big difficulty. Absolutely. And yet you want environmental clearances for pipeline. Mr. Nageswaran, we will never develop this way.
No, I listen. I mean, Siddharth, you are raising some very, very important questions, and I am not at all. In case you had the impression that I'm an environmental activist, let me disabuse you of any such notion. So I'm not. I'm not. And I, as an economist and as a policy maker, I would definitely be grappling with this question that you are raising, and I totally agree with you. I wish I had a sort of a ready-made answer to your question. We need to make sure that some of these things are tailor-made, and just as you were saying with respect to environment, even with respect to finance, some of the markets that we adopt, whether it is derivatives or whether it is options and futures and trading and all those things, some of these things should follow a particular stage of development, not precede. So we are importing some of these things from the West, which are not necessarily suited to our context, and it is not just only with respect to environment. I can list finance, which is my area, and there I see that happening there. So your point is very well taken. Ultimately, development has a context, and we have to choose those policies that suit our context. So at the principal level, I am very much with you, but because I'm not a person specialized in this space, I can't give you much more specific answers. I have to sort of stop here.
Thank you very much for your patience and allowing me to buttonhole you on a subject which you necessarily aren't supposed to answer. But since I had you here, I thought this was important to bring into context, because while we are great as a nation at policies, and we keep changing policies, and we have changed so much in the last few years, I think the reality of allowing industry to do industry, allowing private sector capital to invest easily, create jobs, set up factories, set up a system where MSMEs can also develop, is perhaps more important as an issue. Mr. Nageswaran, were you wanting to say something as I was wrapping up?
No, I'm good. I think I simply wanted to add that multiple actions need to be taken, and I think between the union and the state governments, many of the challenges I feel lie at the level of the state governments going forward for the coming decade, if we have to grow sustainably at 7% or so. So that is the last point I want to make, and wrap it and leave it there with you.
Absolutely, you have hit the nail on the head. We could do a completely separate seminar, a webinar on Punjab as a state and its own economic priorities, considering the amount of interest they have invested on continuing with a old system in agriculture. But I'll leave it for some other time. Mr. Nageswaran, thank you very, very much. I know there are more questions for you, but we have run out of time, and I want to thank you for your time, your patience, and sitting through the entire session, the previous session also with us. With that, it's a wrap on this presentation on Atmanirbhar Bharat by Swarajya and NEWJ. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much once again, and see you some other time.
Yes, bye-bye. Welcome, most welcome. Pleasure talking to you.
Bye-bye. Take care.